You are about to be treated to a conversation that made my jaw drop. Because today we're joined by none other than Andrew Maine. And if you don't know Andrew, he is one of the captains of the modern AI industry, having worked directly with OpenAI on the development of projects like ChatGPT. And he's also a world-class magician and best-selling author. And when he said, hey, let's get together to talk about what I'm doing to generate mnemonics in the age of artificial intelligence as someone so closely intertwined with these technologies, well, what he said totally surprised me. It wasn't what I was expecting at all. So the ways that he's using mnemonics to supercharge his memory, well, you probably haven't considered them yourself. And if you've ever felt friction when trying to come up with a new memory palace, or you've gotten stuck trying to come up with associations that you're going to use when using techniques like the major system or a 00 to 99 PAO, you need to hear exactly how Andrew is using tools for his own memory progress. And also some of the tools that he's decided not to use, such as a particular technique that he had tried using an app for memorizing Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. There's also a very, very special, very small way of practicing his memory that I hadn't considered before, but I think you're really going to love it. So this ultimately isn't about having artificial intelligence to do thinking for you. It's about how mnemonists like Andrew and myself are training our brains to be sharper, faster, and more magnetic, and we thought you would like to sit in on our conversation. So strap in. This is ultra valuable insight, and I really appreciate having someone who's really on the cutting edge of technology and so interested in memory. Andrew, thanks for joining me, and we got an opportunity here to talk about memory techniques and what you're doing using some of the AI tools. And maybe by way of starting, I would just say that I've historically, for a big part of my career, been a bit resistant to too much speculative mnemonics and just sticking with the tradition, so to speak. I've certainly used some of the speculative mnemonics, I believe is a term I heard from Tony Buzan, and it may be in one of his books, but I think he just said it to me personally. And that had to do with like SEM3, the self-enhancing or self-expanding matrix, and the bounds of where you're just thinking about memory techniques and not really using them, mistaking activity for accomplishment. And I now see that there's actually this place where we can do a lot of activity that actually is the activity, the exploration with the tools is the accomplishment. And, you mentioned that you're using some of these tools, so I'd love to catch up with what you're doing and the outcomes you're seeing.
Yeah, and I want to be clear too, because I think that I think what Tony had said was very worthwhile, because I noticed that I am lazy. And when I encounter any friction, I look for a solution to make that friction easier to get past it. But in learning, like working out, the friction is sometimes very important. And you have to sort of identify, I think, do I want to use a tool because it's going to make it easy for me to avoid the hard part that's actually going to help me learn? Or do I want to use a tool because it can help me learn more and learn more often? And I think about that a lot whenever I try to, because my first impulse when I started getting into memory methods was I'll make an app to quiz me on this, I'll make an app to this. When I was first, having worked at OpenAI with the first image model we had there, DALL-E and DALL-E 2, I'm using it to create visual mnemonics, which can be kind of cool. But we kind of know the real value comes in being able to put these things together in your head. Having DALL-E make, a hippo standing on a crate is a great way to remember the name Hippocrates. Really better to form that in your own mind. And I certainly found that it was very useful. I think that sometimes what's very helpful about these tools, I'll talk about one is just in forming the memory palaces or forming the images. I think that we often get stuck into the idea of saying, yeah, I can't think of anything that rhymes with John. I can't think of anything like this. And using a tool like ChatGPT to say, can you create an image for this? Or can you create an example for this? Can show you, yes, you can be doing it. And then you need to be the one doing it. I think that I found it really helpful in sort of exploratory phases, because on one hand, having somebody else describe their memory palace can be usually pretty boring. It's like a dream. I think you've described that. But sometimes it can be interesting, and you find out that, listening to you talk on podcasts to people about how they break up spaces and the difference between how a memory champion trying to do a speed run of memory palace versus somebody says, I need to take this room, this library, and make this into a place that I'm going to hold information for a long time. It's helpful to understand those distinctions. And so I'd say I've been using I've got probably on my phone probably about nine different, probably 9 to 10 or 12 different apps that I've used for different memory methods. Some are good, some are not good. I did experiments with like trying to do like in AI, there's the thing where we basically called masking to see if you could remember stuff. This was my attempt to use that for the Raven. Terrible, didn't work very well for me. But other things were very good. But I kept coming back to why? Why an app? Why not something else? Am I going to lose something? And you know what my favorite method now is for portable for doing card memorization?
Deck of cards.
A mini deck of cards. I have there's a bicycle deck of cards which I use, which is basically much smaller. I can fit this in my pocket, and if I go, if I go to church or something with my wife, and I find myself sort of standing somewhere in a line or something, and want to sort of occupy my time. I can just run drills with a deck of cards. I figured out how to, do one-handed, basically push one card from the top to the bottom. And it's a great helpful way. I've got apps on my phone to do that, but I like Tactile. You've spoken to memory champions who talk about the fact that they're really good with the electronic software, but when it comes down to actually physically holding something, they're not so good at it. And other people advocate for, doing things in more chaotic environments, which I'm a fan of. So I found that what I do now is I try to find, what's going to get me to get the most reps into practice. Maybe it's an app, maybe it's something like a mini deck of cards. And then I start using the tools to quiz me. ChatGPT is great, you know, going to a church once every Sunday, and saying, okay, what are the books of the Bible? Maybe I should just use the church as a memory palace for doing this. And then asking ChatGPT, give me a random book of the Bible. Let me see if I can tell you what book came before it or after. And then, by the way, what was that book about? Because it's been a long time since I was in Sunday school.
Right, right. Yeah, it's super interesting. I love decks of cards too. I got to get one of those mini ones because these are so cumbersome and big, but I carry them around in a shoulder bag usually.
Yeah.
But the idea of, pairing the books of the Bible and then what the books are about, these are quite monumental tasks. And I was thinking more about how I would how I would go in and use one of the GPT tools. Like you mentioned John,
hmm
and instantly I'm thinking, okay, what rhymes with John? Well, Shaun of the Dead, right? So
hmm
do you have ideas about how you would better train? And I think, as you know, I've been training some GPTs, but I never quite get them where I would like them to be, except for that they would force me to say, John rhymes with something in popular culture, which is Shaun of the Dead, but then that it would know that, it would draw from popular culture and it would know what I know, basically. Like, are we there?
Yeah. Well, it's gotten much better. So, like, I have in front of me my latest card person action object, and some of these were ones suggested to me by ChatGPT. And particularly when you look at people who are trying to build up, if you're trying to, I use it, for numbers, I use a 100-digit, PAO. But if you're doing 1,000-digit PAO, or you're doing shadow system or something like this, man, it gets hard to think of a lot of different stuff. And these model can and you look at one of the most commonly thing people search for art of memory and elsewhere is other people's memory palaces or other people's PAO systems, because you're sitting there trying to figure out like I remember when I first tried to do this, I came across some initials. I couldn't think of anything, and I didn't understand the creative freedom to make it be whatever I want. That I could take. It doesn't have to literally be the initials of somebody else. It just has to be something that's close to. And I think that's partly what I think the models can be helpful for, is to help you break out of that.
Mm.
I think they've gotten better mnemonically, poetry, rhyming. There was a reason when, 2 years ago, the models couldn't rhyme because the way they looked at words was different than we do. They look at these tokens. And so, a token for the word, love looked very different than a token, for shove. It didn't look, so the model wouldn't know that those two words rhymed unless it explicitly came across somewhere in the training material that those words rhymed, and then it could generalize and remember that. Now they're better. Now they do that.
Right. Yeah, it's such a interesting puzzle to solve. I was listening to, I think it's the most recent, as of now, episode of your Weird Things podcast, and
Mhm.
I'm listening to it, so I don't know what it looked like, but you're like generating a Sasquatch, I think it was, and was what was so interesting to me is that even without seeing what you're generating on the screen, I'm able to generate some idea of what's going on. And then if I don't know if it was a Sasquatch or some other monster, but if I wanted to like really, really
I think it
memorize,
was Dogman was the latest one. We were,
yeah, it was Dogman, but I think it was
yeah,
like what would or was it not a Sasquatch? I don't know what it was. It was some kind of monster
yeah.
as a podcaster. Anyway, but
Oh, I think you're right. Yeah.
the like just listening to it without seeing it, the question to me about how we could get a GPT trainer or something to help people think like the mnemonics thinks. Because the first thing I'm thinking of is of Sasquatch is, well, SAS is in it. This is Andrew Maine, who's involved in software as a service at some abstract level. Not that you're
Mm-hmm.
directly involved in software as a service, but that's SAS as it's normally sort of pronounced. And so mnemonically, the trick in this particular strategy is conceptual linking. SAS is a sound in Sasquatch. You're doing it, and you're involved in this general world in which SAS is a thing. And so I don't I don't know how we would ever get people
Well,
to have this done without a chip. But then once you have the chip, is it still even going to be able to think that way? Um,
I think that I know for me, it was a muscle that I had to learn to use when it came to creating images and constructing images and learning how to do that. And it's often just illustrative examples can help you do that. And when it comes to if you said, hey, uh sitting in a room full of people. I think the danger is we say, okay, I will have that do that for me all the time. Like, no, literally when we look at people who are really like you and people who are really, really good at this stuff, your ability to form images is way better than it was when you started. Your ability, like I run this when I try to teach people how to do names, like, oh, I'll come, I meet, I met a guy named Norman. And so, my first image is the movie, Paranorman. And I just see the claymation character, whatever, and I do that, which is really hard for me to communicate to somebody else to do that. But once they understand that they can do that kind of free association or whatever sticks the best, then they get that. And I would say that I think I would say the purpose of a tool to use AI would literally just to be, let me take the thing you thought was really hard and I'll show you how easy it is. And then now you know to do it. And I'd say that's really one of the things that instructors can do that's great is you can say, hey, I've got 10 things I'm stuck on. I can't do it. And you're like, great, I will pick one of those. I will break that down for you and show you what to do. But it's really important for you to do the other nine. But at least having and not having access to you to maybe have a GPT that could say, okay, I think I can help you out here.
mm. Yeah. What do you think is going to happen or what is happening now with general literacy? Because one of the interesting things that someone told me, a mnemonist and a mentalist named Richard Rubin, not to be mistaken with Rick Rubin, that really opened my mind to think in all kinds of category or all kinds of ways about a thing that I noticed and never had an explanation for. So when I first started teaching mnemonics, like nobody had these massive doubts or worries or questions that one would be associated with D&T. It was just kind of accepted that you would do this work. And he said, you got to listen to this podcast called Soul to Story about this whole um, kerfuffle, let's say, of students not learning phonics for decades and decades. And then I thought maybe
Mhm.
that's why all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there's just these people who can't get it. Like they don't have any reading background, but not only do they not have a reading background, they don't have pleasure in reading, they don't have pleasure in wordplay. There's no Lewis Carroll like dancing around in their head ready
Mhm.
to go. And so now with these tools and I don't the impact to literacy and so forth, I wonder because to me it seems like there's an opportunity to have it even more playful because of Nano Banana, etc. But I just wonder what you think we're
Yeah,
gonna do.
that was a great episode, by the way. Listen to that, and it was a thing that having followed the education, what happened, and we brought up about that of like how when we disassociated, literally trying to teach students the whole word, you're like, what? cockamamie idea was that, we'll just go for the whole word recognition, understanding how to phonetically, literally the word is in there phonetically, and what you get, listen, the Bay Area, they literally they pulled math, algebra, like out of, primary education because a lot of kids weren't testing well. And it seems like, I don't think getting rid of the thing that you're performing poorly at is a way to get people better at it. It's a crazy, crazy idea there. I think that my concern has always been, I thought about this a lot, when I was involved in the skeptics movement, trying to tell people, hey, ghosts probably aren't real. Maybe ask more questions about homeopathic remedies and other things. Some people had the idea that our goal was to eradicate those beliefs. And I'm like, that's not my goal. My goal was to give anybody who's curious access to information. Previous Snopes.com and Wikipedia and Skeptics Guide, if you were trying to find out, were UFOs real or did a faith healer really be able to heal somebody, you would be left to one, wouldn't even be newspapers didn't want to handle it. If it came to any kind of psychic stuff, they'd let the religion editor handle it. And then whatever was a popular book or something like that, there really wasn't any sort of crowdsourced material on this that was really a good way to find out, unless you happen to happen upon, a Psychop or Skeptic magazine. But then once we lived in a world where I could go into Google and I could search this thing, are UFOs real, and get different results and be able to analyze this, I think this is a much better place. Now, there's arguments we talk about the bias in Wikipedia, which I can happily show you numerous articles. I say, like, this is literally some editors who've grabbed hold of this, and like, you try to go anything into the origins of COVID, whatever, you're going to find out that, there's a very push towards the zoonotic theory, which I don't think is really that well supported now. I think it was a lab leak, but that you're gonna find these pockets of stuff there. But I'd say, as on whole, we're in a world now where it's easier to find out, get access to these things, and it comes down to which way you choose to go. I think when it comes to learning and education, I am discouraged by how much very poorly, or actually methodologies with no empirical support, can sometimes take hold in school systems, things like this. On the other hand, the bane of a lot of teachers' existence is ChatGPT. I've met students now who are using ChatGPT in high school, are now working in artificial intelligence, become incredibly self-taught. So I think that if you're a self-starter and you're a self-learner and you have a little modicum of critical thinking, understanding, you're in a great place. Mm-hmm. Is that good ultimately for humanity as a whole? I don't know, but I prefer it to a top-down approach where nobody really gets access.
Yeah. It's really difficult for the human mind to stay out of either or kind of categorizations, because it's either going to be human teachers or robot teachers, etc., or it's either going to be this or it's either going to be that. But it seems to me that there is a kind of sham to education institutionally overall, because we do have people who, if they're curious, if they are self-starters, etc., they're just going to learn. They're going to teach themselves what they need to know, and often despite what the education system is doing, not in any sort of way that it put wind in their sails, although there's always a contradiction there, because I can say, yeah, I skipped school to go read 1984 because I didn't want to read a separate piece by John Knowles, or something like that, I think it was. But at the same time, wouldn't have been reading anything if it wasn't for school. So it's not like one or the other, but there does seem to be this kind of thing that's right in front of us that we're always trying to deny, which is that some people are just going to do, and they're going to do regardless. And yet at the same time, isn't it going to be that big data is going to thrust it upon us eventually? Like, it's just going to be, hey, if you want this, here's the exoskeleton, and it'll make you do it, despite whether, you feel like it because you've said it's your goal.
Yeah, I don't know. I would say that to go touch upon an earlier thing of like in the either or. I did an interview. So I host the OpenAI podcast, which is the official OpenAI podcast. And I interviewed Jakob Pahotsky, who's the head scientist at OpenAI, and Jakob is brilliant, probably one of the smartest people in the world. And I asked him, the question that people ask is like, is AI going to replace teachers? And he laughed at the idea, because he pointed out a teacher that he had, a very influential person in Poland, who actually was taught a friend of his who was in the podcast with us, who worked at OpenAI, and how he saw the role of the teacher was as inspiration, is to see that. And I think a lot about how I can use ChatGPT is a wonderful resource. It's a great tutor. I spent a lot of time learning from it. And I actually use you as an example a lot, is that having another human being, in this case, somebody who's tried these different methods, tried all this stuff. ChatGPT can tell me this verbatim spit out an Anthony Metivier script, but it hasn't had that actual experience. And short of being able to talk to you or listen to you, it's great. But be able to have real people with real experience is extremely valuable. And I think that even though we can be cynical and say, well, are people going to want that? If you look at a lot of the content on TikTok, it's people teaching other people stuff, sometimes dumb stuff, but people want to learn. We want to learn and we want to learn from other people. And often I find that the people that are using ChatGPT to learn a lot aren't saying, no, I don't want human teachers. They're like, I don't have enough. I don't have enough teachers in my life. So, in lack of having there's really good data that shows that humans are much better delivery vehicles for the same information. That there's just all these sort of things that come into play. It's when I hear people say like, "Oh, what are humans going to do?" I'm like, a lot of what we do now, and probably more of it. So, I would say that I think that we will get into a place where I think AI will probably be a very effective part of education. I think you should be able to educate yourself quite well purely through AI tools. But I think that always having the human component is going to bring not just probably help you learn a little bit more, but also give it more value.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. So that reminds me of something I wanted to ask you that was on the OpenAI podcast. I didn't memorize the names of the people, but one of them was talking about like black hole research and,
Hmm.
just sifting through all kinds of articles and data and so forth. And I was thinking, my goodness, that all sounds really good. But how on earth do I, as someone who knows nothing about black holes and astronomy to speak of, how do I ever fact check anything that this guy's saying? Not only to fact check that he knows what he's talking about, but then that what he's excited about the LLM producing for him is valid and so forth. Like it seems there's this big crunch coming of just us getting further from validating things because even if we go to the humans are like, oh yes, but of course. I don't know, like, do you know what I'm saying in your memory of that
Yeah.
discussion? I,
Well,
I just felt so alienated and included at the same time, and it was just a kind of cognitive dissonance of where is the human in any of this?
yeah. So that was Alex Utaska, who's an astrophysicist, yeah, who started using one of the new reasoning models like O3 at the beginning of the year and was a skeptic and then realized it was very useful. But he you have to sort of like obviously for me or you to go in there and say, oh, is this really right about information decay and black holes? I'm not going to know. But when you talk about reading, Francis Yates, and you realize Francis Yates never tried these methods, and that's evident to you in your own domain, you're going to have a pretty good idea. In your early experience with ChatGPT, you saw that it was giving you incorrect information. And I'd say that we as we start off, obviously those who are more educated about this will sort of know, but I would say that in the beginner phase, as long as it's better than the average resource, then it's good. And I would argue now that ChatGPT is as good or better than the average introductory, thing about memory palace stuff. The expert will notice it's the Gelman effect is observed by Michael Crichton. The more you know, the more you're aware of like, well, that's not correct. That's not correct. This is actually correct. And I'd say that if you're pushing the frontier, then you're going to be kind of knowledgeable when you come up with tests, and they think that, Alex Wachowski, they come up with like, how do I test this? The same as if a fellow colleague brought you, hey, I have a new theory. And we find out that, humans are really bad, have been historically, we found out that, a decade of Alzheimer's research was based upon bad data that nobody ever questioned. The head of Stanford found out that he had a whole career of scientific misconduct, or when it came to his research papers were fraudulent. And it was a student that discovered this. And I always say, like, how come of the thousands of people that became exposed to this research, it was a student that pointed that out? And I think a lot of people knew. They just didn't want to say it. A lot of people had suspicions, they didn't say it. And I'd say that, at least with AI, is that it's self-correcting much more quickly. And as far as, how do we know? I think when it's, introductory stuff, it's good. When it gets on the frontiers, you test it.
Mm. Well, this may be the classic meaning of apocalypse, right? The great unveiling, seeing things for what they really were. It's just
Mm-hmm.
because you can get a sense of, oh, that was not quite right, and the the fraudulence of it. There's a guy named Timothy Kenny. I don't know if you ever see him on YouTube, where
Hmm.
he has these bookshelf tours, and we've recorded two things that haven't been released yet. But one of the topics that comes up is the charlatanry in memory training, and
Hmm.
I'm getting more and more sensitive to it because as I age, and I went through a big uh, issue recently that kind of led to a lot of sleep deprivation that's slowed my progress a little bit mnemonically. But like there's a lot of hiding of mistakes in the memory world,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of exposure too. But it really feels like people aren't going to be able to get away with it in quite the same way, even in athletic performance, and more exposure, which may help with greater transparency, but also greater comfort with being human. But at this point, I have to say, I feel a little bit weird and at odds because it feels now that the mistakes I would make mnemonically are even more mistakes because I'm playing more and more with a device or an algorithm or an LLM that is just getting more and more accurate. So there's a kind of I'm not sure what I'm trying to say, but it's just a bit of a weird moment also knowing how important some mathematicians and programmers put the Lolian memory wheels in the history of the development of both mnemonics and programming and computational thinking and that sort of.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but to tie it back to this apocalypse, this great revealing, there is this sort of feeling um, that we're not going to get away with stuff quite in the same way
I,
that has
I,
been
and I,
going
and I,
on.
I mean, yeah, we're, my wife brings this up to me, say, I found so and so compelling because they sounded so confident. And I said, yeah, that's the kind of the trick, and that kind of the best scientists I know aren't all that confident. They'll go, we think this is likely to be true.
Mm,
And we have to sort of teach ourselves to pick up, people who project confidence is not always proof. It's actually there when there was a cost to that, certainly perhaps, but now when there's not as much cost to it, when I see this in AI, where you have, a guy says, so and so said this, that we're hitting a wall. I said, yeah, they said that last year. They said that the year before. They said it before. I think, when do you decide this person is terrible at predicting? Because so far they haven't, and people tend to forget about these things. I think that, we're in this age of, you know, you can be more analytical, regardless if you're using, AI tools to do this about your own performance and stuff. And sometimes you have to ask yourself, why do I want to do this thing? And do I enjoy, if you enjoy the process, then it doesn't really matter if you're not getting 90% recall or whatever. If it's really just, I like this. I thought about this a lot in magic. You and I are both, magicians. And as a person who was a professional magician and a magic creator, inventing magic, I had to think a lot like, okay, is my ideal target a professional that's going to go work in, professional environments and do this, or the hobbyist that wants to pull this out and show his friends and coworkers? And I think that sometimes we sort of belittled the latter, but often there are more people doing that, and that was sometimes this other form of experience. And now, as a person who doesn't perform anymore, I kind of love to look and see what's a new magic trick out, what's going on there, what's this and that experience. And I think that before, I mean, some of us need to worry about, is this real or not? Is to sort of go like, why am I here? Why am I here? Again, if you're studying, if you're using mnemonics because you want to be a medical doctor, you're an Alex Mullins and whatnot, probably helpful to make sure it's accurate. Probably pretty good.
yeah,
But if you're like, hey, I just want to try to memorize some of my favorite chapters of Harry Potter or whatever, and I'm like, yeah, it's a different. And I think that's where we have to be concerned, is to say, will it matter? Will it won't?
yeah. So you mentioned The Raven, the Edgar Allan Poe
Mm-hmm.
poem, and an experiment with masking on a digital screen.
Mm-hmm.
What was it that made you want to choose The Raven in the first place?
It seemed like an appropriate sized thing to be able to memorize word for word. It seemed like it was a good chunk. It's, in historic. I've been looking for examples, of things that I think what would be helpful to memorize, that I would like to have memorized, and that looked for a good thing. Another thing I've been doing now is memorizing like the chapter titles of I have project I'm working on to say like how much can I remember of a book by starting off with like chapters of books, and I found out that actually like going chapter by Harry Potter makes for a pretty convenient memory palace. And so I've been looking for kind of these things that are like, can I, and it's sometimes the risk of being too clever, but things that are just what would I if deck of card memorization is fun for me. I think it's really good for creating like mental images. It's a great party trick, but beyond that, as a magician, I can do any number of things that will impress people without the same amount of practice. I look for things, would it be longer term? Like if 10 years from now, if I had the Raven in memory, that'd be kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I've been looking at various, I think that we shared on Twitter or X, sorry, the various variations of the Sam the Bellhop story deck.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's quite interesting because you need to recite some kind of text while doing deck management, while
Hmm.
doing audience management. It's just a lot going on. And it's also
Yeah.
the story is the least of it, but in the context, because of the way that performance works, you still have, and I'm kind of getting at something here, and I'm using the word context very specifically. I think we're getting at something that is increasingly important to me in memory that has to do with what tools people train with. In the context, the deck's order can become the prompt, so that you kind of can still, as long as you know it, you can still make mistakes here and there. And I've made mistakes with a different kind of deck, Billion Dollar Brain. I don't know if you know that with
Hmm.
Darwin Ortiz, and it's one of those weird tricks where you can really mess it up, but still look super impressive, as long as you mess it up in the right place, in the
Yeah.
in the right phase. Um,
Yeah, I find that and for anybody, it's so Sam that bellhop. It's routine where you have a deck in order and you're able to basically tell a story because like you keep tipping Sam $2, you pull up a two and you whatnot. And I knew Bill Malone, who was like one of the best practitioners of that, and it was an amazing routine. And it was funny because I took sort of a different approach where I'd been studying this lately because I was looking for permadex, things that would be helpful deck orders outside of Magic. Because like in Magic, knowing a deck order is great, but I was like, can I find other examples? Because I'm trying to take the magic out of everything I do in a performance and try to find a way that I can show people stuff like this is how great memory is. No, this isn't a trick. And it's one thing to sit there and memorize a deck of cards if anybody has the patience to watch me do that. But it's another thing to say, okay, let me take a deck of cards, let me put this in an order, and I'll tell you a story. And so I was looking through at the same time you were, or you probably much party, but I was looking through and found, what were other versions of that. There was a Soldier's Prayer, which are really, if you want to look up, tell people go look up YouTube Soldier's Prayer, which is just using, one suit, of cards is interesting. But I thought like, one, it was really interesting too, was like I was using ChatGPT to say, okay, can I do Star Wars? Can you help me arrange a deck into an order that would tell the story of Star Wars? And that was actually kind of an interesting tool because sometimes I'd reach a dead end and I'm like, I don't know what to do. And it had some pretty good ideas about like, what to do, and sometimes some terrible ideas. You would realize it has a trouble with mnemonics. You understand that the association between words and stuff, but um, anyhow, it was a very interesting exercise for me, and to see how many times people have used that to do sort of stuff because I love any example that I can stay with me and then I can show people later on and go, oh, that's cool.
right, right. Well, with the Raven, you had this masking, I think you said.
Yeah,
Sometimes that I
yeah. There. Go
Go ahead.
ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, sometimes
Yeah,
I
it's
think that's called a close test, also like COLZ.
yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's one of the ways that you can train an AI model is that sometimes you do things where you try to say, I'll give it train out a bunch of data, predict the next sequence, and then yeah, the closed or in masking, the way this works is I can adjust it is that you train it on a bunch of stuff and then you have it try to predict the things that come in between. And so I was trying to take a method from training AI models to see if I could use it for retention. And some things work. The challenge is that the lesson was with language models is that and any kind of model is that you have to figure out the right amount of compute for the task and for a model to learn how to fill in the gaps. It might take a tremendous amount of examples, but the algorithm doesn't have to be very complicated versus trying to get it to predict the next sequence or a likely sequence. Maybe I could use a really powerful algorithm and less examples. And so that's the thing that we think about too, is that how hard is it for us to memorize? How many times do you have to be presented with something? And something you mentioned before was trying to find the right questions. I just spoke to some people who were asking me some advice because I didn't know how complicated writing flashcards is. And there are people who are really good at Anki and these other methods because they're really good at figuring out what the right prompt is.
Mm.
And I think that that's one of these things I think about, like, they're going to tangent, like how much of our education system's based upon, well, it works well enough, let's keep doing it, versus trying to optimize and make things more efficient.
Mm. Yeah, well, this is where the context word comes in because I feel like it's such a weird time where the battles of the corporations and content creation are against or feel against, and it can be a misperception. But I have this old article that I want to revisit on context dependent memory. And it seems to me that this is more and more important, maybe more important to me as I age, but just I think it's part of this giant key to memory and learning and mnemonics more than I ever appreciated. And so context dependent memory basically is this idea that if you were to use a lecture hall as a memory palace, and that lecture hall is the same place where you write the exam, there's likely going to
Hmm.
be a benefit or a boost. And back to people training and having great results with a software. Well, in that software environment, because you're in that context, then there's transfer effects and near transfer effects, and often those effects don't go outside of that context. And I've experienced it in a way that frustrates me because I can go into a room quite easily and memorize all the names of the people with a high degree of accuracy, and any mistake I make is typically a pronunciation error. But when I'm in online environments, even if it's theoretically just as personable as you and I talking, I won't memorize names quite as easily. And it's not just that that person's name isn't they're not there, they're absent, there's no one to see. Um, but it's also that I just don't train in digital environments to
Hmm.
memorize. So, I mean, it's just so interesting when you talk about, carrying a deck around, and then I think the transfer and the near transfer, it just has a much wider net
Oh
because
yeah.
of the fact that most information that we memorize is in three-dimensional space one way or the other, and it's not locked on a screen that has no dimension, if you know what I mean. So,
Yeah, no, I agree. I remember, I think in the research into the whole how context matters, they even point out that people who are mildly buzzed, if they got buzzed again without they could have a higher retention, which he thinks seems counterintuitive. And I would say that, one of the things as an early prompt engineer that I realized was that the AI models perform a lot like people do, and vice versa. And one of them is that, and I've heard people say, "Hey, we're not like a prompt engineer, we're doing context engineering." I'm like, well, that's what I was doing 5 years ago. Was that if I wanted to get a model to do a thing, I had to put it much into that mental space. If I wanted it to write something like a professional research journal type article, I would start off with a heading, the journal of such and such research by Professor so and so. And we found examples with earlier models, if it was a professor, it would perform better than a student. It was just literally because it would spend more time thinking from the starting point of professionally prepared papers than student papers and stuff. And context matters in so many different ways. And I think one of the ways in which we train better, if you're working, you can learn a lot from like physical training, and that one of the things that trainers tell you to do, you've got to mix it up. If you mix it up, because all of a sudden the muscles become everything tries to find the lowest energy state. Everything wants to find the lowest energy state. What's the minimal amount of energy? After enough time of working out, you find out you can call in some other muscles to go help you with that movement. And then guess what? You're not going to have the same growth versus changing the way you do that. And I think when it comes to memory, is that the danger of just using digital apps or things like this in the same way. And I've seen this. You've seen people, they talk about people who do language learning, will do language competitions, vocabulary competitions, and cannot talk to somebody in another foreign language
right.
because they learned one modality of that. And that's why one of the reasons I love my little deck of cards and stuff is I go to noisy environments and I go to different chaotic situations, because it comes back to what you mentioned about the name stuff, is that I can sit there in front of software all day long and get really good at names, because that 8 seconds that I have per name, nobody's bumping into me, nobody's distracting me, there's no music playing or whatever. But when I go to a party and I'm in a different environment, it's a very different challenging situation. And I think that often we come to sometimes be discouraged because like, why didn't I learn? Like we did, but you got 20% better, but you couldn't tell that, you know. Side note, one of the things I do now too is whenever I go to a dinner party, whatever, and I memorize everybody's name, I make a moment. I pull myself off to the side, and I'll pull out my. In this case, if I'm usually I try to use my iPhone, so it's easier to pull it up later. But I write down the names of the people I was with in the order, and so like I have like several dinner parties. I could tell you where everybody sat because after I got their names, I sat down and said, I might later on want to recall it, but it's helpful.
Well, it's the old Simonides trick. Knowing
Yeah.
only the names, but where they were. Yeah, but when I do
Hopefully,
events,
we won't have a cave in, but yeah.
no, no, definitely not. But when I do events, whenever possible, I get the business cards also, and that
Well, that's smart.
is kind of a physical reinforcement of where they were because there's also the memory of having met them.
Yeah.
Or
A little unrelated memory tip too, I tell people is when you get the business card, take your phone out and photograph it too. Um,
yeah, that's a good
you know,
idea.
and something I've done inspired by you is like when I go places, like I was waiting for my wife at Macy's, I carry around a piece. I have these little small notebooks that I carry. They fit in the back pocket from Amazon. I have a little half pin. I can carry this with my phone. It's no burden. I get in the habit now of trying to break places up into memory palaces. Just literally just break, because I think that the biggest blocker for me has been not enough memory palaces. And kind of particularly when I'm trying to do decks of cards is that I go through a drill and I need to do it again. I don't want to use the same palace. And I'm like, well, I've only got four palaces. I need to break that up. So I would just say that's something that people think about. Like anytime you go anywhere, maybe the place you're in is going to be terrible as a memory palace. Still get in the habit, and I've gotten by listening to you, gotten much better at looking at a thing, going, okay, it's not just a corner. There's a TV in the corner there, and there's a desk, and there's a lot of space under the desk, and it's like, oh, I've got four places there that I didn't think about before. And by exercise, I just I'll make an intentional thing. I've gone to my local library. I use that for presidents. I use the church that my wife goes to for, books of the Bible. And I'm starting to figure out what are my long-term palaces, but also you want to have a bunch of short-term ones. So everywhere I go now, I just like, how would I use this?
Yes, soon there will be hundreds of them if there aren't already.
Yeah.
It's really quite good for the brain also, I think, because there's just a larger sense of what this world is geographically and
Hmm.
what space is. And I've seen, and maybe you've seen, a lot of homeschooling becoming more prevalent, and people are finding things like trivium and quadrivium. And one of the elements of the quadrivium was geometry and astronomy, and those are very, very much space and distance based practices. And so I'm thinking more and more about how to incorporate that more strategically. I started by reading Euclid and memorizing some of the phrases, and I got off on a tangent trying to figure out what on earth he means in the first three sentences, and it took a while. But now
Yeah,
I think
I'm
I get
not. Yeah, it's amazing to watch. Watch the depths by which you delve into this stuff, and sometimes I'll listen to a thing you say, and then I'll be thinking about a week or something, and in the sense of spatial sort of thing, that was the thing I thought about, how a lot of stuff was flat for me, and the stuff you talk about, tactile stuff, and an exercise I use now is I imagine like an invisible hand going around the room and touching every surface
that's such a good
and
idea.
feeling different stuff, because you talked about how things can be tactile, and it made me think about how much I take for granted, because I was thinking about, we know of several, performers, people who are blind and whatnot, extremely capable, and there's this conversation going on in AI with robotics. How much do you need visual information versus how much is tactile, which is better? I think visuals probably ultimately you can do a lot more with that data, but I do think tactile is super important.
Mm.
And so that's the thing. I think it's a fun thing too, just to sit there and imagine your hand is roving around every surface in the room. And you do start to think about depth, and you start to measure things and texture and stuff. And that's the thing too, by the way, I've done with my memory palaces now is I build these other versions of it now where I do tactile. I'll do my person action object, like what tactile about the person, what does that feel about that action, that object, and trying to work on scent and to try to do this sort of stuff. And then that's one of my exercises now as I go through there. Like I'm trying to still get past the vocalization thing. It still happens, but I'm trying to get past the vocalization to pure. I think visual is the fastest, but those other methods are helpful.
Okay, so say more about that. What is it about vocalization that you dislike or
Oh, well, no, not the dislike. Going for speed. When you're going for speed, and there's really good arguments that, that people said, oh, the way to speed read is get rid of vocalization. Turns out that you probably don't enjoy it and learn as much. But I do think that for when you look at, when somebody says, when you get a 12.67 second, a 13-second world record for doing a deck of cards using a PAO, uh, you have to get past the vocalization. Somebody has to get past the vocalization part of it. And I think for most people it doesn't matter. But I have been trying to speed up my card times because I do want to do it in the concept of a demonstration to be able to show.
Mhm.
And right now, I'm above 3 minutes, which is not, and it asks for a lot of patience from the audience.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you're doing when you do it, but
Yeah.
here's an interesting idea for you that maybe you haven't come across, or if you did, you didn't uh, think about it or what have you. But in terms of these people who are doing sub 10 seconds or sub 12 seconds, typically the shadow is involved. The shadow is major based. So I think it's not trying to skirt the the vocalization, but actually go through it. So because it's major based, I think the training effect comes from just having it so vocal, like uber vocalized, so to speak, that it's no longer slowing you down, especially at those speeds where they're like I think you have to take into account that if you make that the speed goal, it's not just that it's uber vocalized as I would call it. It's so well trained that it's just fast enough, but that it's trained in such a way that they're doing two cards at the same time.
Well, I
But
believe you're right.
based on the foundation of the phonic vocal association. It's not that they skipped it, but they went through it, or that they subverted it, but they went through it into it.
Oh yeah, no, I think I have some cards I don't have to think of the name. I'm past the name. Like some cards I hold up. If I say 8 of hearts, I know that's Harry Houdini. Like it's seven, like literally like to me, it's like it's immediate, whatever. And I guess that's saying it's like get to the point where I'm not stopping to do the thing, where I get to the recognition
Or
part to get there. But remember, I can pronounce his ring on the Mongolian Shiri Erdenbot Inc. He says he uses a PAO, which I thought was interesting because I was started working on the shadow, and then I saw that the world record is supposed to be by PAO. But again, I don't know how much lost in translation, which I thought was very interesting because they up till now I had thought that it was everybody using the shadow system, but then but again, he could maybe be throwing people off too.
well, there is a bit of that goes on, yes.
Hmm.
Um, also in chess, there was a period where these guys thought, oh, we're making money from publishing our memory methods for chess, and then they realized that their competitors were catching up, and so those books just suddenly disappeared, and nobody wanted to talk about them anymore. Uh,
Yeah.
Very, very interesting to me. Now, I don't know 100% for sure that that's what was going on, but there was this period of time where people were asking me, when are you going to do a review of this book on chess mnemonics? And then the author of the book would agree and so forth. And then all of a sudden, it not only did the interviews never happen, but then I never got responses and the books just disappeared. They weren't being marketed in the chess magazines anymore, etc. So,
Yeah. It's a weird world. Like for me, I have no intention of ever trying to set a record in anything. But I do look for like efficiency in some ways, and that was the thing too. Is I looked at looking at the shadow system made me realize that there's a correlation between how much effort it takes to learn a system, versus the efficiency, but also like then to maintain it versus like what is that happy medium between okay a 100 digit. If I remember looking at 100 digit PAO sounded like hard to me. That sounded really really hard. And then you're like, oh, it's really not. A few weeks of practice and you actually get it down. But then you kind of look at the shadow and I'm like, okay, well that's great if I want to be a competitor, but I don't. Like what is the advantage there? And that's like trying to find the most hyper efficient way in which you could probably, if you're willing to spend the time learning how to encode it, how to do the recall in it. I remember you had a conversation with somebody and they brought up that they were using their town as a memory palace and not going into buildings because their speed, they just want to go bump, 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 bump from one spot to other. And it was very insightful to understand how much a goal matters, how much somebody's goal really matters, and not trying to confuse a memory athlete's goals for my own.
Right. I think that was Don Figures, maybe
Yeah.
was saying that. And to me, that was always a little bit puzzling because, and this is an idea that came to me from Nelson Dulles. Just like, why move at all when you can just teleport from station to station?
Yeah.
Like, you're adding this
I don't,
additional cognitive load if you're imagining going into a room. Um,
but there is some interesting data though, on tracing the hippocampus that as you go through a route, that the way the hippocampus encodes it's interesting because there is some stuff that basically says that if you when they put somebody, they monitor somebody's brain function and they look at them recalling a movement for their house, they can see that movement in the hippocampus. So it gets into weird. I remember you also spoke to somebody who'd said that maybe it was Dodd too that said that when he put our I think it was Ruben who said that when he put people into names into a memory palace, even though it had nothing to do with where somebody was sitting or whatever, they had a higher rate of recall. And it's a very man. There's so many of these little areas that are so underexplored that
oh, if I had the budget and whatever you need to run various experiments, I always wonder like why aren't they doing this experiment and why are they doing that experiment? There seems to me so many interesting experiments that don't get run. Now I could be a bit scientifically illiterate in the
mm,
experiments that I want to run, but why wouldn't you get people doing well, there is one actually, which is the Tyson Yunkaporta and David Reeser. They were the two head authors of the let me think if I can think of the name of the university, Monash University,
mm,
study with the Aboriginal version of the Mary Palace technique. And what was so interesting about that study is they actually matched it to subjects that actually needed the information.
mm.
Because so many of these memory studies are just about information that nobody needs. Like, who cares if you if you see this data and so forth? Now, I get it because of scientific literacy that I don't have. There is a reason, but at the same time, why don't we just get our cake and eat it too, and just study the stuff that people actually need to memorize, so we get the data on the usefulness, the utility. If you
Was
know.
that the paper that had like a very provocative title about being better than the memory palace or something? And then I think
Yes, and
you,
then and Tyson and I had a big laugh about that, and he was just like, basically, he was just like, stupid white man logic, kind of
no.
would come up with making it a battle, another
Yeah.
dumb battle that they need to have, better than.
Well, I love empiricism though. I do love to find out what's the best way to spend money. There's a reason why flying carpets don't fly and airplanes do. So,
But
I think that,
it wasn't different. At least if I understand what Tyson was saying, it's just
yeah,
it's not different. And then we had a joke about like who says that ancient Greece was in the West anyway? Like it's just a
yeah,
ridiculous idea that
yeah. Oh
it
yeah.
was Western.
A lot of these things are way more universal. We used to do it. I hear like, well, Eastern medicine. I'm like, there's empirical, there's not empirical. Like there's people on both sides have done good and bad methods. And the best progress ever is when we go, I don't know, let's test it,
Yeah.
Um, and in a whole Indian tradition of that and whatnot, and different schools of thought. It just gets people, yeah, people get into this weird thing. It would be interesting. You've probably got to have quite a large mailing list of people to do something. Maybe we should come up with some sort of large scale project we could do and ask people to try stuff. I'd be willing to to help you out with that, and we needed to put some resources into it. It could be a very fun experiment to do.
Yeah, I would love. Actually, I have ideas. We can. I have an idea for an app that I maybe will talk with you privately about also. And
Hmm.
I just don't have the passion for playing with toys, technology to sort of work it out. But I had it wireframed years ago, and
Hmm.
ultimately never did it. But and it went through an incubator, and there's reasons why I decided not to do it. But now
Hmm.
with the GPT stuff, maybe it makes more sense. And then that would
Yeah.
be a way of actually gathering the data because if we can, however APIs work and all this sort of stuff, like siphon up the data so that it's actually honest rather than people reporting, filling
Hmm.
out surveys and so forth, we can see the rate of. I think I know
I
to see the rate of recall properly. Quite frankly, um,
That would be amazing. I think too, like even stuff like you've had people do memory palaces for you. It would be amazing to try to get as many of them that people have done and then look at like, is there a common pattern towards how many loci people have per one and their ability to recall age? I think there's so much data about memory that's literally just there to the asking if you have a large enough audience to say, hey, what
mm.
have you done? What data can we share? Take this quiz, do this stuff, whatever. I think we could move the needle probably a lot towards understanding on stuff, even by just saying, you know, asking questions.
Well, yeah, there's interesting data that I have, which is how have people interpreted the instructions? And I have their memory palace drawings, and
Hmm.
there's a ratio of people who have understood the instructions and done it relative to those who kind of understand it, relative to those who just go and do their own thing. And
Hmm.
it's like they're not even listening to what I'm saying at all, which is cool. And interesting, some of the things that people come up with. Like speaking of closed tests, one that I thought was just super genius, and I don't know that there was a level of thought in the person's thinking that is the same as my thought, but he drew his memory palace in such a way that he covered parts of it with sticky notes, which to me presented an idea. Oh, you could actually do a closed test version of your own memory palace if you were having trouble remembering locations and you wanted to memorize a location, but then test your own drawing of your own memory of the
Hmm.
memorized location. So there's just, yeah, there's so much stuff to be done. There's an endless pool of work, experiments, ideas to get people involved and so forth. My worries are the honesty in reporting, how to deal with that, and
Hmm.
also that we get it to that people are actually memorizing information that matters, but that it isn't my bias of what matters, but that there is still some metric that it matters and that they're tested on that it matters to them. And then what's going to be the utility? And the utility can be as simple as exercise, but I think we need to think all that stuff through because
Yeah. I think though, but I think that there's a lot of things that we sort of take for granted that we know are true, but would be great to sort of support and actually get more nuance to it is people ask me why a deck of cards. And I'm like, well, taking three random cards and creating an image is a really good exercise in getting better at creating images. And I think that part of the success of a lot of memory champions is they spend, several weeks or months or years creating those instant images, just creating those images. I think that we could come up with some very easy ways to sort of test for that and to be able to say that, like, let's make the case that creating visual images in your head actually helps you with other things. Does it help with other stuff? Like, I'm much better at recalling numbers now, even when I don't make the effort to try to encode the stuff. I notice like, oh, I've seen this, but that's anecdotal. Is it?
oh yeah, there's all kinds of well, see, this is where it's beautiful though, right? Is that the effects that are created, partly they are created just simply because people are now doing something with their minds that is either
Mm-hmm.
novel to them, which theoretically in some research would increase norepinephrine, which is involved in novel experiences are involved in memory, like norepinephrine production, which has some linkage to memory. Now I'm an armchair neurologist here in saying that, but that's what I've read, and I think it makes sense to me. But then also let's just say that it's not new. People are also returning to the way that they would have processed as when they were kids, which is a little bit more associative, a little bit more hands-on, a little bit more free from punitive measures and perfectionism and am I doing it right kind of stuff. It's just like plow in like that kid who's just
Fun.
yeah, like running in the mud kind of thing, splashing in the puddle and not worrying so much. So, yeah, I can see. I don't think it's anecdotal. I have enough responses from people who've just said, I haven't even really done anything yet, and already I feel like I'm remembering more. I
No,
believe
I
it.
agree. I believe it too. And I'd say that like it'd be great to one quantify and to get an idea of how soon do you see stuff? Because I think for a lot of people, again, I think we could probably figure out a bunch of basic things to say, hey, let's provide some supportive data that sort of shows this. I think I've seen, I mentioned this before. I think last time we spoke was you've observed this to some extent, and I saw this with Dolly with the image model, is that people who had aphantasia, had described actually starting to have some sort of nascent sense of creating images in their head, you
Mm.
know, and that's a great one to explore because and it's weird because on one hand it's a condition that people say it must suck to have it, but when you look at the number of cartoonists that actually have that, it's really high. And a lot of people in the arts have these things, and so it's interesting to sort of I don't know, I think that would be interesting. Sort of, there's a lot of things that we could questions to be explored. That
Speaking of anecdotal, I mean, I don't know if we could ever wing it, but always wanted to ask Penn Jillette about his experience with
mm,
Aphantasia. And that, speaking of things that disappear from the internet, I mean, that episode of Sunday School just disappeared from the internet. And out of respect, I never clipped the part where he talked about it. And I tried to get permission, but it was gone and I never heard back. So even if I never interview him, I would love to just get that episode and permission to clip that part where he's talking about Aphantasia, not only to refresh my memory and make sure I'm not misquoting him, but I think it would just inspire so many people to yeah, see a successful person.
mm. Well, I was you know the study about about Pixar and that, right?
Um,
What Ed Catmull did. Ed Catmull did it because Ed Catmull has aphantasia, and he actually asked internally at Pixar how many of the cartoonists there had it, and a high percentage had it. It was a really high percentage. I did a podcast with David Eagleman, the neuroscientist, and we're talking about this, and it's one of these things where and I've known a number of artists that have it, and it's kind of, I think David's sort of ad hoc explanation is that, like, if you know what a moose looks like, you're fine. But if you have this, you're like, well, moose, and you sit down with a piece of paper and a pen, you got like, okay, I think there's a nose here, I think this there, and you actually develop the skill that the people who see these images in their heads don't.
yeah, I mean, I still maybe I overthink things, but I still don't even know what it means to see an image. Like I see pictures on walls, and that makes sense to me. But the idea that is in my mind is so different than an image. It's I still worry to this day that there's some kind of hoodwinking going on where people have just simply convinced themselves that they have a different mental experience. And I'm not saying that there aren't different mental experiences to have. I just think that there's some problem with the processing of the idea of what exactly is going on. And if you look in the history of mental imagery and the debates about what mental images are supposed to be, there is no consensus that I can find that visualization is seeing pictures as such. Um,
Yeah, I've made the argument too, because like when we look into people who don't have inner voices, like I don't know observationally how much you can tell the difference to it. Like I and also there's a limit. Like to me, it's more of an, like, if you say, like, right now, I'm imagining an apple, rotating it this way, whatever. But if you said, okay, now do that with a Rubik's cube with all the things in order, I can't. I'm like, anybody can. I mean, well, there's ways to encode that, but I would say it's much harder. But I'm saying that, like, I know that I can. I was a magic designer, so I was very good at sort of saying, okay, I see this thing in my head, I can see this idea. I think if I rotate this, whatever, how accurate it is, how realistic it is, it's everything. But I certainly convinced myself I can see it in my head.
yeah, and I don't mean to say, oh no, you didn't, like to question that, but
No, 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 no. Yeah, I don't. But I also, yeah, I mean, I had a friend who made magic puzzle boxes who didn't see those things, and they were intricate puzzle boxes. And I'm like, the thing that I do to see it in my head,
mm,
there may not be any real utility to it. It could be just a post hoc thing going on in my head that says this, but we do, they are, but it is something like synesthesia and what like that. There's hyperphantasia, whatever. I mean, it could be a gradient, but where you see the limitations from it, you know.
that's always a fascinating thing to me with the synesthesia because of how the extraordinary cases tend to, when you dig into it, have mnemonics involved. So the Daniel
Mm.
Dennett story, which seems to have been scrubbed a little bit, so maybe it's just my memory. Maybe I just dreamed that he was found to have taught a mnemonics course. But there that
Yeah, he was the one that could never give you the same description for the things that he claimed to have synesthesia for, though, right?
I don't know the whole full story, but I know at one point
Yeah,
they had him do a language learning sort of thing, and then
yeah, Icelandic, and yeah,
yeah, they found later that actually there was this old website in the Wayback Machine where he had been teaching mnemonic techniques. Now, that doesn't
yeah.
mean that there is no synesthesia going on, but it raises questions. Same thing with the Jill Price story,
Well,
where,
I would say okay, good. Sorry. Yeah.
well, I shouldn't say it's the same thing, but what it is that there's a pattern that when the media gets involved and they make a thing seem different than it is, and then other journalists go and poke around. Jill Price was found in a car, like obsessively OCD, writing down everything. So that's not really classic, highly superior autobiographical.
Yeah.
That's something else. The boy with the memory, I've never memorized the name of the title, but Dominic O'Brien is with the kid memorizing cards and all this sort of stuff. You never actually see whether the kid actually recalled any of those cards, but what you do
Yeah.
see is a high self-fascination where on his wall is endless photographs of himself. So the idea that, and journaling. So the idea that he has this better recall of all this stuff is not as clean as what we're being presented in popular media. Same thing with Shereshevsky. There's a mnemonic element to his practice. He had a practice. It wasn't just what the speed reading of Luria gets you in the end. It's more complicated what's going on here.
Yeah, having worked for several years investigating paranormal claims, I often found that things the further back in time, the better things sounded, and then when you get closer to it, and then going and looking at looking at like therapeutic touch or some of these other things, it facilitated communication, which I never met the people did it, never saw it actually demonstrated, saw a magic show, or people who are, misrepresenting things. And I wondered back because like, the people go, well, Shereshevsky, and we go back and we look at that and I'm like, given that how we found, like you mentioned somebody recently who we found a lot of evidence to support they're actually using memory palace work. They said they had Synthesia, but when they actually asked them presented the same things to them, a month later, it was a completely different explanation for, oh, this is this. And it was like, how, whenever you test these things, they seem to evaporate. And I always wanted to Shereshevsky if he was a guy that was he a journaler? Was he other thing? Was something, maybe not. My world would not be shaken to find out that it was everything people said it was, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out that like many other things, there was maybe another element to it.
Well, an interesting guy to talk about this stuff with is Sal Piacente.
Mm,
Piacente, I think you probably better pronounce it. He did the Rain Man show, and he knew Kim Peek, and
mm,
it's quite interesting. I met him one time, and not Kim Peek. I met Sal, but it's just an
Sal.
amazing guy to talk about that stuff because he reproduces those things, but not quite because he has to use mnemonic techniques and so forth and mental calculation. But it's just a really fascinating topic, and getting to play Houdini with it is always has a little bit of a bad taste, but at the same time, I want to know what the real story is because I think there's clues in it that can help other people who are extraordinary find their extraordinariness and stop playing games of comparison with shadowy stories that were never quite what you were told.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's always the hard part is we hold ourselves up to these examples of which we don't have, and we get. And I mean, what I loved about Josh Fior's book and Moonwalk with Einstein was when he starts to talk to the memory athletes, and they all made the case we're normal people. This was a skill we learned, and I think that sometimes we want to find examples of people who are genetically or whatever special and different. Like, oh, that's cool. And then other times, I love the stories where like, oh no, I was terrible and I learned this. I had to go do this. We kind of think we want to be the prodigy, but really, I think you want to be the person that knows how to apply hard work and to acquire something because that means there's no limit. You're going to be able to acquire a lot of different things.
well, speaking of hard work, how's your time?
I've got a call in. I'm going to just postpone him another 10 minutes with Luciano K, who's a guy who I've been talking to about some of these methods for memorization of like Anki and whatnot.
Oh,
So I've got to hop off in another 10 minutes if that's cool.
yeah, yeah. I thought I'd better check in.
Yeah, no, this has been, I could talk to you for, hours.
Well, we can always find a time and go more into some science ideas or experimental ideas and the app.
Yeah, I would put some thought into that. Like if, what would it take, to put together, I don't know. I mean,
Well, I have some
you know,
ideas of what it would take. I just don't know how to swing it because, and leave this part into the podcast because maybe someone listening can also get involved. Is that I have entrepreneurial weaknesses. In fact, I'd rather not be in the position of being an entrepreneur at all,
Hmm.
really, if I could avoid it. But I have to. And so there's always the how to solve the puzzle of getting help to do these ideas and execute them and to do them well when there's so many balls rolling that I can't just let drop in order to continue doing this
Hmm.
work. So I don't know the answers to that, but it would be, and I believe me, I've read like all the entrepreneurial books that I can handle and order and leadership and all that sort of stuff. But it's just not in my DNA. And I've had people say very nicely, look, memory guy, can't you figure out how to build a proper company and like have employees and all that stuff? Like you ought to be able to do that. And they do it lovingly, but it is a weird puzzle in my mind because I can't figure out Google Ads either. At least not, not in these like whiz bang ways that you think that a smart person should be able to. But that partly is that I'm not able to figure out how to do these things where it's like, wow, you could be involved in experiments and actually do it where it's not driving the project into the ground, but actually helping it grow. You know what I mean? So that's part of solving.
Yeah.
And to
Yeah.
do
I mean, well,
is not what I despise, which is like another product that's selling ads to something that's really not helping people because, oh, you got a digital memory palace now. Yes, activity, but where's the accomplishment? It's just like an
I,
accomplishment focused mission that actually delivers.
I'm a big believer. You find the team, and sometimes you find the team by a starting of another project to say, let's try a thing, and then you find people, hey, I like the thing, and you get other people involved. And I found this like when I was filmmaking. If I want to make a film, find the people that want to show up and do it, and then you start to. There are a lot of people enthusiastic, and the problem is you can start a project. I've got all these people want to help, and then you find out when people find out what the real work is. Yeah, you've got to move a crate from here to here to here to here, and like that sucks. Other people are like, this is the best time I ever had. How can I do more of this? And I'm a big believer. You start with a project and say, hey, who wants to jump on board to help see if we can get this thing done, and then from there you pick another project and you scale up. It starts with sort of picking a thing, and it can say like, I can do X. My skill here is I can do X. If there's somebody else who's good at this part and that part, then we figure it out. So
Cool.
I would say maybe an app's way, but I'm thinking it could even be like, let's do some fun research stuff, you know?
Well, I've got some stuff written down already about research, so we can
Yeah.
find time to go through that. And I really appreciate all your interest and support and sharing your experiences as a fellow mnemonist and what you're doing. And thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Anthony.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Well, I want to thank Andrew again for joining me and for pulling back the curtain on how he, as an innovator, is using traditional tools to help expand the potential of his memory rather than replacing it with something that is still quite new and certainly could help in the future in ways that we can't possibly imagine now, but with a kind of really refreshing, how shall we say, concentration on the ancient techniques that we know work and sticking with the brain as it has evolved and noting that it's not really going to evolve all that quickly just because we might like it to. Now, on the matter of people using AI, before we go, I have something important to share with you. We're living in a time of rapid technological change, and as we heard today, that can be a wonderful thing, but it also opens the door for a lot of noise. So consider this a kind of a public service announcement, and it's for everyone because I know people listening to this podcast care about memory, they care about the future of education, and here's what's going on, basically. Lately, I've seen more than one new, quote unquote, new memory method floating around that demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of a couple of things. One of those things is memory science. And what's shocking is that some of the people floating this around claim to have academic credentials, which may or may not be the case. But I'm quite shocked because when I called them on it in a public forum, they deleted their post in order, ostensibly. I mean, I can't make an outright accusation, but it certainly seems like they deleted their post in order to delete my criticism, because my criticism was quite extensive, And it asked for them to reconcile how they could have academic credentials and say such things about memory science, and also how that they could go about describing the memory palace in the way that they had, because it betrayed a certain lack of scholarly study of the ancient art of memory that one would expect if you're going around saying you have these academic credentials. And then there's a misunderstanding in a lot of the material about what happens in memory competition and just the nature of the memory palace technique itself. Now, I don't know that I know everything there is to know about the memory palace technique. I've been teaching it for the past 15 years and been using it for almost twice that amount of time. But I just find it very, very surprising when people say that the memory palace is a linear technique and that its linearity is its limitation. And there's two problems there immediately. The first is that if you think the memory palace technique is linear, then I don't think you understand the ancient way that it's been used. I don't think you understand how memory competitors use it. And I certainly don't think you understand the science around it. It's a very weird thing to say, that the memory palace technique is limited because of its linear nature. The other weird thing about this is that the linearity is not a problem even if there is a linear aspect to it. And the reason why the linearity is not a problem is because everything that we recite follows the arrow of time. So it's not the case that the memory palace technique is used only in a linear fashion. This is something Aristotle talked about, and Hermann Ebbinghaus later codified it into science, that the memory palace technique is used in a nonlinear way. This is where we get the term serial positioning effect. And when we do have a linear feature to it, it's what helps us recite speeches that we've memorized, because speeches come out of our mouth following the arrow of time. In any case, you might notice that I'm not naming these folks, and that's at least for the present, the Streisand effect may just lead you to figure out who it is anyway. But one of the reasons why I'm not naming them is because I'm not even sure that it's more than one person. I just get lots and lots of emails from various people, and it's almost like they're trying to trick me, that it's like, I don't know. It's just really, really weird, but it's always a variation of the same thing and saying that it's a new approach that these people have come up with. So watch out for this. And again, it's possible to critique the memory palace technique. It's a technique. Certainly it has its pros and its cons. I don't really know that it has any cons that are super severe, because you get to learn something about your mind just by using it. But there are certain times I don't use it to learn, that's for sure. But this idea of it having linear navigation at its core is just bizarre. That doesn't make any sense. And so I don't know how that they can go around critiquing it based on something that's just not true about the technique. And it's just so strange. So watch out for that. And I encourage you to read Aristotle. Richard Sorabji has a book about Aristotle on memory, and he's like totally puzzled by the passage in De Memoria where Aristotle's talking about entering the middle of the alphabet. Well, that's precisely where Aristotle is teaching you to use the memory palace in a non-linear way, which again, Hermann Ebbinghaus later codifies. So it's about spaced repetition and the non-linear features that, as far as I know, only the memory palace enables you to do as efficiently as is possible. And it's better than how spaced repetition apps operate to get spaced repetition going, simply because you have to use it voluntarily and you're not offloading the responsibility for showing yourself the information later to a device. You have to do the recall rehearsal manually. So that's, I just find that really sad and alarming that people are critiquing the memory palace for something that's just not It's not really part of the technique at all. So watch out for that. The other thing is to watch out for techno-babble, especially when people are using fancy new terms to describe the very simple principle of mnemonic association. Not even real scientists use terms as obscure as some of the stuff I've been seeing. And again, it's like been on forum posts that wound up getting deleted, but also emails that are sent to me. And they come up with these new terms, quote unquote new, that really just mean elaborative encoding. Now, elaborative encoding is a term from psychology, the psychology of learning, of memory. It's a term we use to describe how we connect new information to old information and then work to elaborate it in our minds to make the information more memorable. So a very simple example is if I have to memorize a line from a poem that's something like awkward grammar appalls a craftsman, which is from Eunoia, a very, very beautiful poem by Christian Book. And it's an award winning, which is a very beautiful poem by Christian Book in a book called Eunoia. Very beautiful poem, award-winning poem. If I have to memorize that, I don't just have associations for awkward and grammar appalling a craftsman. I have to elaborate them. And so awkward, would then take an image, and then that image would be exaggerated. It would have a kinesthetic element added, an emotional element, a sight, a smell, a sound, a taste, all that sort of stuff, right? Well, that process, elaborative encoding, is not improved by adding sci-fi terminology to it and insisting that you have a new approach when you don't. So sure, new terms are cool, but please don't claim there's something new about what these terms are referring to without some serious and solid evidence. So I'm not saying that there couldn't be something new and serious and solid that emerges, but if you don't have the evidence, be careful and watch out for people who are doing this. Third, many people I've seen are trying to address people specifically with aphantasia. And this is concerning because they don't seem to understand the research on encoding and decoding, or exactly when the brain decides to decode information, which is part of the key to helping people who have no mind's eye, or as they call it, aphantasia, as Andrew and I talked about in today's episode. This is very troubling because a lot of people have talked themselves out of being able to use memory techniques. And a lot of people don't seem to know that memory competitors with aphantasia exist, which bolsters the existing research on when exactly decoding occurs. I can go on and on and on about this issue, but basically, I'm very concerned, and I just wanted to make an announcement about it without necessarily pointing out any individual person, because I don't even know exactly how this network works. Only just that a lot of it seems identical, and so it may not be that it's multiple people. But if it is multiple people, what it suggests is that they are accessing an AI to generate their material. And so it's just rehearsing and reciting and regurgitating what it already said to somebody else. So it's literally like someone said, hey, come up with a unique sounding approach to mnemonics and criticize the memory palace technique. And then it just regurgitates the same thing that it regurgitated for the last person. So, as I always like to say, carpe diem, seize the day, but always caveat emptor, buyer beware. Because another thing that some of these people are doing is saying, well, but you can't criticize us because we're not selling anything. Well, not yet, you're not. It has all the hallmarks of the sale to come. And, we'll see how things go. But just watch out for the word new. I don't think there's much new coming in memory training. The shadow, it's new, but it's also not new. It's built on what was already there. And the people who came up with it, Lance Shart in particular, and then other people have refined it from there, they're very clear about where it came from, and they're not claiming that it's new. It's an innovation on the technique in order to solve a particular problem. So what we're really talking about is the same ancient methods wrapped up in bubbles and sold as a teleporter. So my advice remains the same.
Look into the history of the beautiful memory arts. Many treasures await. And nobody should be saying this, not that. I'm not naming this, but please go ahead, look for it. The reality is that you want to know about as many things as possible. And myself as a critic could be wrong, but I don't feel wrong when I see things being deleted after I level criticisms on them. And my bad is that I forgot, quote unquote, forgot to take a screenshot, because these people were saying that they're associated with universities, and academic behavior is usually to preserve knowledge and discourse that has been produced, not memory hole it. So thanks for listening. And as I always like to say, until we have a chance to speak again, thanks again, and keep yourself magnetic.